Last week's lesson looked at the call of Peter from Luke chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. And this week, we're going to look at the call of Levi, who also goes by the name Matthew. We think of him as the one who wrote the Gospel of Matthew. And let's read there in Luke 5, verses 27 through 32. After this, Jesus went out and saw a tax collector by the name of Levi sitting at his tax booth. "Follow me," Jesus said to him, and Levi got up, left everything, and followed him. Then Levi held a great banquet for Jesus at his house, and a large crowd of tax collectors and others were eating with them. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law who belonged to their sect complained to Jesus, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" Jesus answered them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." Now, Luke's account here is so brief about the call, you might get a funny picture. You might imagine that Jesus just walked up and pointed his finger like this to Levi, and, well, he just got up and away he went. It's that reminder to us, Jesus was the talk of the countryside. So Levi had surely heard of Jesus. Chances are he had even listened to him personally speak. He may have been one of the people in the crowds. Maybe he had even seen a healing or two. So Jesus wasn't just some stranger walking down the street saying, "Come here, Levi," and he did, and away he went. Levi had heard about Jesus, and he made a very bold step. He left everything, and he followed Jesus. There's a special sense of heroism in Levi's following. As far as Peter and the others of the 12 who were fishermen, they did leave everything behind as well, but there would always be a lake, and if things didn't pan out with this Jesus thing, they could always just get another boat and get back out to fishing in the lake. But Matthew or Levi, they couldn't say the same thing. If here he was a tax collector, and by first century standards, he would have made plenty of money. He worked for the Roman government. But yet they wouldn't look too kindly on a man just up and leaving his job all of a sudden for what they considered to be no good reason. Do you think the IRS normally rehires a district supervisor who just walked off the job one day, and then he comes back 3 years later saying, "I'd like to have my job back"? I'd imagine his chances of getting hired or rehired are zero. And so it's that reminder to us, when Matthew left, he left it all. But he was putting first things first. God came first to him. And we should follow his example. We should let first things be first in our lives. That God comes first. That yes, we need to make money, but we don't live to make money. A clean house is nice, but cleanliness is not next to godliness. And we need to give the TV a break. And of course, as we think more modern times, we need to give our iPads and tablets, our cell phones. We need to give them all a break and put first things first. We've had enough junk food for our soul, and we need the real thing in Jesus Christ. Now, what's the first thing that Levi did? Well, he threw a party. And parties are usually associated with birthdays and anniversaries, graduations, and weddings. Did you throw a party when you became a disciple of Christ? My guess is that I doubt it. Have you ever thrown a party for someone else when he or she became a disciple? And my guess is probably not. Yet we see here that that's exactly what Levi did. He was happy that he was following Jesus, and he was going to celebrate it. And this is another reason why I believe sometimes we're just religious enough to make our lives miserable, that we don't celebrate the things that we should be celebrating when one becomes a disciple of Christ. We forget that Jesus said his yoke is easy and his burden is light. Jesus came to lighten our load, not to make it heavier. And this should cause us to rejoice and not be gloomy and pessimistic Christians. Jesus has made life easier for us, and he has promised to help carry our burdens during those times when we see that the load is so heavy. Now, when Levi threw this party, he invited his friends. A man who is headed for heaven does not want to travel alone. Since he was a tax collector, many of the friends that he invited were tax collectors as well. And the tax collectors were considered unclean. They were outcasts because they collected money for the dreaded and despised Roman government. Therefore, the Pharisees couldn't be caught dead at this party. But they could stand just outside, far enough away to see what was going on. Maybe we'd think today in COVID terms, the safe 6 feet or so apart. But yet they were close enough to see what was going on, even though they wouldn't be caught dead having a meal with the tax collector and sinner. And they were close enough to complain to some of his disciples, "What's your teacher doing? Eating with these sinners." Jesus responds and shows us that he is the great discipler. Most rabbis wouldn't even teach a hardened sinner. It would have been shameful. They would have been considered unclean. But there were some rabbis in the first century who would teach a sinner, but only if that sinner came to him first. These men were rare, but Jesus is a third type of rabbi. He didn't wait for the sinners to come to him. He went to them. He sought out sinners to teach and to save. And as we think about this, the big question for us as Christians is, what about you and I? What about churches today? How do we compare to those first century rabbis? I would say that some churches are like that first group. Of some churches, just they don't even want to be bothered with somebody they would consider to be a sinner. They only want to deal with those who are pretty good already. I would say that some are a lot like that second group, and that is, we'll teach a sinner, but only if he comes to us first. They don't go out of their way to reach out to the lost. And far too few fit into that third category, and that is being like Jesus and going out to people and actively seeking and saving those who are lost. With all these thoughts in mind, I'd like to read to you a quote from a gentleman. His name is Norval Geldenhouse. He wrote a commentary or a book on the book of Luke several years ago, probably in the 1950s or so. And here's what he says. "So the message comes to the church to launch out into the deep and there to cast the net of the gospel. In spite of all failures in the past, the Church of Christ must again and again renew its energetic attempts under his guidance to gather in souls for his kingdom, and must do this not merely in the shallow waters, but in the deep water, not only in the vicinity of settled church life, but also amongst the great masses of people, where the need is so great. When the church is obedient in this, men will be caught. Her work will bear fruit." Well, there's so much there in that paragraph that Geldy wrote several years ago. And even though it's been maybe 60 or 70 years, there still is so much truth there that we as Christians, as individuals, collectively as a church, that we need to launch out into the deep waters. Will we give up the comfort of yesterday for the challenge of today? We know that today we live in a brotherhood where so many churches are comfortable there in phase 2 of, we'll teach them if they come to us first. Too many churches and too many Christians are way too comfortable with this. Just like I think about a pair of jeans. I'm much more comfortable in an old pair of jeans than in a new pair. And I'm much more comfortable with shallow fishing. I think about going out fishing with Abby. I'd rather be fishing from the bank of a lake or a creek rather than going out into the deep waters. And the same is true with Jesus. Jesus is calling us out as far as being disciples of him to do some deep fishing and to seeking and saving the lost around us. And so many times we are scared of that challenge. And the question is, what will we do? Jesus tells us, don't be scared, don't be afraid, that he will teach us how to be fishers of men. Christ is calling you to come off the bank and out into the deep, and he can teach you. He believes that you can do it. Will you accept his challenge today? Or maybe there's someone who's been hooked by what we studied earlier, whether earlier today or earlier in a previous lesson. Are you tired of being religious enough, just religious enough to make yourself miserable. Hopefully you will enter into that relationship of being a loving disciple today, and that you can be the bride of Christ that he wants you to be. Are you lost and ready to be transformed? We sure hope that you will come to Jesus by belief, repentance, and baptism, and commit your life fully to him. There's a whole lot here to think about. I hope you'll take it to heart. I thank you very much for listening, and I hope that you have a great day.